PGP creator Phil Zimmermann.
We started moving our lives into the digital world. And for that, we needed strong cryptography. My motivation for developing PGP was about human rights and democracy. People were being killed by oppressive governments or war, and PGP was saving lives.
Because of PGP, this is really one of the only reasons that we know that Satoshi Nakamoto existed at all. Today we have this idea that Bitcoin was sort of the missing piece of the early internet. The Human Rights Foundation, pretty active in kind of promoting Bitcoin. Does that make Bitcoin as successful as PGP?
Well,
Permissionless, the crypto industry's leading developer conference, is coming to Brooklyn this June 24th to the 26th. And this time, Bitcoin is showing up in a big way. That's right. With confidence in Ethereum and Solana on the decline, interest in Bitcoin development is riding high. And yet the way forward for many builders remains unclear. Layer 2s, meta protocols, soft fork upgrades. We'll be talking about the future of Bitcoin and how and if it needs to change. Of course, tickets are going fast. You can get them today at blockworks.co. We'll see you there. Hey everybody, this episode of Supply Shock is powered by Core. You're going to hear a lot more about them later in this episode, but first, a word from our sponsors.
Hold Bitcoin and earn yield. Staking Bitcoin with Core, the leading Bitcoin scaling solution, earns real yield while keeping your Bitcoin right where it is. No lending, no bridging, no wrapped assets. Just lock your Bitcoin using Bitcoin native time locks, help secure the Core network, and earn liquid Core tokens. Your Bitcoin never leaves your wallet. Still your keys, still your coins, now your yield. Ready to put your BTC to work and earn max yields? Start staking at stake.coredao.org/blockworks.
Hey everybody, Pete Rizzo, the Bitcoin historian here. On today's episode of Supply Shock, we're bringing on someone whose contributions to cryptography and privacy have had a real impact on the history of computer science. I'm talking about PGP creator Phil Zimmermann, a decades-long advocate for human rights. Phil was on the front lines of the crypto wars during the 1990s, where he fought off the U.S. government overreach that attempted to thwart civilian cryptography development. That case dropped in 1996, became a landmark worldwide for internet rights. Following that, he launched Silent Circle in 2012, focusing on secure communications. And he's worked on other secure email protocols in use today. Today, he's a cryptographer, professor emeritus, speaker at technology conferences globally. Really thrilled to have you here and excited for this conversation. Welcome, Phil.
my pleasure.
So, Phil, I wanted to start, obviously, a lot of people in Bitcoin know you as for your development of PGP. And I wanted to start with, I guess, an interesting curiosity of history, which is that, because of PGP, this is really one of the only reasons that we know that Satoshi Nakamoto existed at all, right? So the founder of Bitcoin is known to the world largely as a pseudonymous actor, an alias, if you will. And we have very scant proof that he ever existed at all. So I'm curious to start maybe about your thoughts on Satoshi and his use of PGP, and just the idea that your contributions to cryptography, enabled this other wave of cryptography and eventually the creation of digital money.
Well, something as complex as Bitcoin cannot be created by someone who doesn't exist. So I'm pretty sure he existed, just probably with a different name.
Well, that's a hot take. I think there's a lot of theories on Satoshi's relevance, but I guess have you reflected on that kind of use of PGP and just what it says about what you created and how useful it's been?
I think it would be interesting to look at the history that led up to PGP and the changing of the laws, which took us an entire decade of political struggle to get the U.S. government and other governments to change their laws. The reason why we saw such resistance from governments about publishing strong encryption software can be traced back to World War II. Perhaps many of your viewers or listeners saw the film The Imitation Game. And it's the story of Bletchley Park and their efforts to break the German Enigma cipher. They secretly broke this, and it changed the course of the war. It probably saved a couple of years of war. It probably shortened the war by a couple of years. They were also breaking the Japanese codes, and that also reduced the war in the Pacific by a couple of years. So millions of lives were saved by their success in doing cryptanalysis. After the war, they kept it a closely held secret that they had made such a spectacular, bit of cryptanalysis in breaking the wartime codes. They also broke the codes of the Nazi High Command, Hitler's email. That was the Lorentz cipher. They built a machine for this at Bletchley Park called Colossus. And after the war, they wanted to preserve their ability to break cryptography of any adversaries that may come up in future wars. And so they tried to control for decades after the war this sensitive technology. And it was pretty easy for them to control it because nobody had computers at that time. Computers were just, the 1940s and 50s and 60s. Individuals didn't have computers.
Right. They were still the size of entire rooms at that point.
That's right. Yeah. So they effectively suppressed ordinary people having access to strong cryptography. But along comes the internet, in the 90s. And it was becoming important to allow people to use strong cryptography. The 1990s were not the same as World War II. I mean, I would have agreed with them in World War II that strong cryptography should be not propagate because only governments use cryptography. So preserving the ability for the US and Britain to break the cryptography of potential adversaries was a good thing for worldwide democracy. But in the 90s, this changed. We started moving our lives into the digital world. And for that, we needed strong cryptography. And it also was necessary for human rights because as you move your life into the digital world, you need some way to protect it. Otherwise, everything you do becomes visible to governments. And if you live in a country with an autocracy, they can spy on you and all your friends and any political opposition that may develop. So, it was time to make strong cryptography available for everyone. And that was the motivation for developing PGP. It started out as a human rights project.
And in terms of the context, I guess, of the launch of Bitcoin, I know that you were involved with the great Hal Finney, late great Hal Finney, who was a contributor to the Bitcoin project and a Bitcoin user. But I want to get your context of where were you at the time when these discussions were happening? Obviously, the cypherpunks group, in the 1990s was actively kind of looking at crypto privacy, digital cash, and things like that. Were you deeply interested in digital cash at the time, and were you following?
Yeah, I was interested. David Chaum had an interesting scheme, but David Chaum did not solve the double spending problem. I mean, you can solve it by centralizing everything, but to try to make a decentralized mechanism that can prevent double spending, Chaum's schemes were not quite enough. Having a proof of work and an immutable ledger, like blockchain, if you put those two things together, then you can solve the double spending problem. And so, for the first time, you actually had a feasible electronic money scheme that was decentralized. I mean, we've had electronic money for a long time, just by banks, but those are centralized. And I think there was some interest in trying to not have it depend on governments and centralization, in part because of the financial difficulties of 2008. So I think it was a very creative breakthrough in the development of digital money.
Well, I know that you've kind of recently become reacclimated to the Bitcoin world. Been at several major conferences, kind of speaking on main stage, and that your interface has really been, and I guess your interest, as you've spoken about it, is about the kind of human rights aspect of it. That this idea that Bitcoin is a neutral money system that helps people kind of escape dictatorships, kind of fights the oppressive forces that you wanted to build PGP to protect against. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
One thing to understand about technologies like this is that their effect on society is not all good or all bad. It has mixed effects. A good example of this is the automobile. A century ago, Bonnie and Clyde started robbing banks using the automobile. And what they would do is they would select a bank that was close to the border of a neighboring state. They would drive their car up in front of the bank, jump out of the car, go in and rob the bank, run back out to the car, and drive away at high speed and cross the border so the police couldn't chase them. The police had never seen anyone do this before. No bank robbers had ever done it before. And the police were, quite frustrated by this tactic. In fact, they even wanted the car companies to make smaller fuel tanks on the cars. Clyde Barrow wrote a letter to Henry Ford, thanking him for developing such a fine automobile that was so helpful to Clyde for robbing banks. And yet, we still use cars for a multitude of things that don't involve robbing banks or doing criminal activity. All these technologies have mixed effects. They enable normal people, law-abiding people, to live their lives and make their lives easier. But cars also have other non-criminal effects that are still bad effects. They polluted the air. They contributed to urban sprawl. They had traffic accidents that killed people. We have to look at these technologies as something that has mixed effects on society. And PGP, when in the 90s, when we were engaging in the debate about strong cryptography and especially PGP, criminals were using PGP. And I knew that. In fact, PGP was in the Al Qaeda training manual. I wish that were not the case, but that's a fact. And some advocates for strong cryptography were denying that criminals use PGP. They were denying that terrorists were using PGP, but I knew that criminals and terrorists were using it. But so was a lot of other people. And it was used in lots of environments where, there was great danger to, people who lived in wartime conditions. I got letters from people who lived in places where people were being killed by oppressive governments or war, and PGP was saving lives. So these technologies quite often have mixed effects on society. And that includes Bitcoin. I would like to see more examples of Bitcoin being used for good. I'm kind of disappointed that this capability of Bitcoin over the years has contributed to enabling criminals to commit fraud and crimes and money laundering. And so I wish that were not the case.
Earn real yield on your Bitcoin by simply holding it. Trustless Bitcoin staking with Core means no lending, no bridging, no wrapping, no swapping, no new trust assumptions. Simply lock up your Bitcoin on the Bitcoin blockchain, help elect validators to secure Core, and earn your share of Core token rewards. This isn't a promise or point system. This is real, liquid, and live yield, fueled by activity on the largest Bitcoin DeFi platform. And to earn even more, multiply your rewards tenfold by dual staking Bitcoin and Core tokens, meaning your Core token rewards become the key to unlocking even greater yield. Start earning Core and put just 1% of your BTC to work. Start staking at stake.coredao.org/blockworks. For the past decade, Ledger has been the global leader in digital asset security, trusted to secure more than 20% of the world's crypto assets. Celebrating 10 years of innovation, Ledger is making digital ownership more secure and accessible with their latest products, Ledger Stacks and Ledger Flex. These wallets feature the world's first secure touchscreens, simplifying your digital transactions while ensuring uncompromising security through Ledger's secure chip and proprietary OS. Plus, with the Ledger Security Key app, you can say goodbye to traditional passwords and step up your digital protection. Ready to protect your assets? Choose the most trusted name in hardware wallets, Ledger, and take control of your digital security today at ledger.com.
Well, as you've gone to these conferences, I'm sure you've met with people kind of on the ground who are using, Bitcoin for things like this. I mean, I can certainly list a few examples that are, the Human Rights Foundation pretty active in kind of promoting Bitcoin.
Yeah. I spoke a few months ago in Argentina. There was a Bitcoin conference in Buenos Aires, and I met a lot of people from all over Latin America there. And Latin American countries either have recent experience with autocracies or maybe, much earlier examples. But in an autocracy, um, the you know the dictator exhibit executes his control over the population in a variety of ways. Some of them violent, but sometimes he just takes their money. And Singapore has a high standard of living and high salaries and a high percentage of home ownership, and everybody gets a pension for their when they work. And the government there has control of that pension. And if you criticize the government, you might lose your pension. And so, if you live in an autocracy, it would be useful to have some of your assets in Bitcoin so that it's out of reach of the autocrat. And I met a lot of people in Argentina at the Bitcoin conference there that had stories to tell about the places where they had used Bitcoin to protect some of their assets. On the other hand, right now we're trying to protect Ukraine from attacks from Russia, and part of that strategy is sanctions, economic sanctions, and so
Russia actively using Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies, it seems, to route around those sanctions from available.
Exactly. And so this kind of gets back to my point about these technologies have mixed effects, and some of these mixed effects I think are terrible. I don't want to see evasion of sanctions. I mean, that's a real war. People are dying, civilians are getting bombed. We need to find ways to stop that, and sanctions are one of the most powerful ways to do it if we can enforce them. So, having cryptocurrencies, including Bitcoin, be used to evade sanctions is a bad thing. So, I think if we're debating the role of Bitcoin in our society, we have to acknowledge the good and the bad. We have to try to encourage the good applications, and as engineers, we should try to figure out if we can come up with some ideas for mitigating or reducing the opportunities for the bad uses.
Well, I guess in terms of how you came to Bitcoin, it sounds like you've kind of revitalized your interest of late. But I know that you had early initial exposure, right? That you worked with Hal Finney, and that you were friends, and that you talked about digital cash projects. I guess, did you have conversations about Bitcoin early on, and does that sort of initial vision differ to how you think Bitcoin is used in practice today, or how would you?
Well, I knew that Hal was working on proof of work. And proof of work was an intriguing concept that it has uses not only for digital money, but for other things. Some years earlier, Microsoft had a project called Penny Black, and they were going to use it. Penny Black, by the way, is the name of the first postage stamp in the UK. I don't recall what year Penny Black was used, but it was the first method of paying for the delivery of mail. And so this project was to make it so that it cost computation to deliver email, because at that time we were just starting to see the rise of spam. And spam is awfully annoying, and Microsoft had a project to try to mitigate it. So what they did was they used proof of work, and how it works is, let's say I want to send you a piece of email, and I have a mail server at MIT, and you have a mail server, let's say at Gmail, and my mail server sends your mail server a request to accept this piece of email, but your mail server says, well, I'll take it, but first you have to solve this mathematical puzzle. And it is to find a hash preimage, which is the same thing that Bitcoin uses for proof of work. And so I might take 5 seconds of compute on my PC to solve this. And I send you the solution attached to the email, and you check the solution. takes the blink of an eye for you to check it. And if it's good, you deliver the email. And if it isn't, well, then you don't. And the idea of the Penny Black project was to make it so that spammers would not be able to send, 10 million pieces of email this way, because it would be 10 million times 5 seconds of compute. And so that was a cool idea, except that, spammers started using giant botnets with 100,000 PCs. And
Well, I
so
have a question
it doesn't work for that.
for a couple reasons, right? I think there's a lot of people today who are really excited about the Bitcoin project, and really, at the time in history where their entire financial lives or entire sort of net worths, are in Bitcoin, right? There's a lot of people who just have that level of use with the Bitcoin protocol, and they see you as someone who was there kind of back in the day at the formative stages, and I think they sort of wonder, since you were so close to these ideas. What isn't that didn't get you kind of up and supporting the project really early on? And I know obviously you have plenty of other things.
Yeah, I was busy with some other projects. I was interested in secure VoIP, and I was putting a lot of my time into that. I did talk with Hal, about proof of work, and I knew that he was spending time on the proof of work problem. But I didn't, I was busy with my other projects.
Mm. Well, yeah, totally understandable. But I think, in terms of, also trying to understand the idea space, right? You kind of come from a group of people who, we today in Bitcoin sort of see as the, forerunner generation, right? We try to kind of hold to the cypherpunk values and try to, to our best kind of capture the spirit of that time. So I'm trying to understand how you would have looked at digital cash within, I think you see yourself as someone who's working on human rights, right? Trying to apply technology to problems that were really on a societal scale. So I'm trying to get a sense of how you would have felt just about the idea of a digital cash and what you
Well,
thought.
it was technically interesting, and that was appealing to me just because it was technically interesting. I didn't think that it was going to grow into this giant project that we see today. It has had a much greater impact than, let's say, PGP. But lots of protocols today have greater impact than PGP. I mean, TLS. Every web browser has TLS. In fact, we use TLS for all kinds of things. So you could say that TLS has a broader impact than PGP. However, I'd like to point out that no one has ever written a song about TLS.
Yeah, unique, perhaps unique. Well, I guess the other part of this question is that I think we have the sense from Hal, right? A lot of people spend a lot of time with his writings. We get the sense from him, this tremendous sense, really, that digital cash was like very important to him, and he saw this as something that could kind of unlock humanity, kind of allow people to kind of transact more freely without governments kind of in the same way. So I'm trying to understand, I think a little bit about, was that widely shared, right? Like amongst the kind of cryptographers and people who you were talking to, was this something that was kind of a passion project for a select few people, or was this something that really, today we have this idea that Bitcoin was sort of the missing piece of the early internet. You have things like the World Wide Web, and David Chaum kind of trying to inject payments and money into that, and that never really coming to fruition. And there's this idea that Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies are sort of this thing that came later, right?
Well, one of the things that made Bitcoin a success is that the intellectual property was not locked down. Like Chaum's schemes were brilliant, but he filed patents for all of his protocols, and those patents held it back. And so he held tight control through the use of patents, and that's why nobody embraced it. It was very brilliant, mathematically, but it had no chance of success because of the patents. There were no patents for Bitcoin, and so that allowed it to spread without fear of patent litigation.
Yeah, one interesting historical footnote, I think, is that if you go by Satoshi's emails, you'll find that he started working in Bitcoin or on Bitcoin around 2007, which is about a year before the Chom patents would have expired. So because they did expire kind of prior to Bitcoin being released. I always thought that was interesting because I think it kind of spoke to perhaps people were ready and sort of waiting and looking to deploy something now that that threat was over.
Yeah, it would have been interesting to see if Bitcoin hadn't come along. Perhaps Chom's ideas would have gotten a little more traction when the patents expired. But it was just in time. Patents only last 20 years, and by the time his patents were just about to expire, then Bitcoin was actually a better solution.
Well, let's talk a little bit about some of the negative externalities of Bitcoin, and technologies in general. So, you mentioned kind of like the global power structure, this idea that, you don't maybe like the fact that Russia is able to use cryptocurrencies to subvert sanctions. Ukraine also raising money, in Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies for its war effort. But I guess do you worry, I guess, about, it sounds like you might worry about Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies and the actual kind of net impact that they'll have on the world, because it does seem like we're moving more and more towards a world where, there's going to be Bitcoin and kind of open source internet based monies, and there's going to be something else that's government controlled that looks like that, maybe like a stable coin type construction.
Yeah. You could think of PGP as having like a pie chart of good and bad use cases. What does that pie chart look like for PGP, for criminal use versus honorable use? And I think that PGP, yes, it does have a slice of that pie chart that is used by criminals, but overall, the majority of that pie chart is for good, honorable uses. I don't know if I could say the same thing about cryptocurrencies. I'm not just talking about Bitcoin, but if you look at the thousands of cryptocurrencies that are floating around now, almost the entire pie chart is the wrong color. Now, I would say that Bitcoin is not as bad as the rest of the cryptocurrency landscape.
Can you speak a little bit about that delineation and maybe how you do see the difference there?
Well, I think one good thing about Bitcoin is that, it's a visible public record. And so that means that compared to the other cryptocurrencies, it would have to be stupid criminals to use it, because it's going to keep a record of everything they do. And the nature of these transactions is such that it's probably going to be possible to identify them. So in that sense, Bitcoin, that's a feature of Bitcoin that provides some kind of obstacle to criminal use. In fact, it's kind of funny, in the Silk Road case, the cops that were investigating the Silk Road crimes themselves stole Bitcoin. And they didn't seem to have as much understanding of the permanent ledger nature of Bitcoin. And that was their undoing. And they were caught and sent to prison. So that's a good thing about Bitcoin.
Yeah. Well, in terms of the negative impacts, I guess, what did you do with PGP in terms of, as the project manager or kind of the face of the project? I mean, how did you deal with that kind of externality, and what would you recommend to the ecosystem that maybe we're not doing? Do you feel like we're not talking about some of these negative aspects of Bitcoin enough?
Well, trying to engineer particular features in a cryptocurrency to try to incentivize more good uses than bad uses, there's a difficulty with that. After 9/11, there was the anthrax attacks. You may recall that. There were envelopes arriving in mailrooms that had a white powdery substance that was anthrax spores, and it killed postal workers and people that opened the mail. And one of the funny suggestions that was made at the time is there was a company that was in the stationery business. They made envelopes and stationery, and they came out with an envelope that had a transparent window right along the bottom edge. That that transparent window they have to show you the address of where it's going, because it's the address printed on the business letter inside or the invoice. Well, they were using that same kind of transparent window material at the bottom edge of the envelope, so that you didn't have to open the envelope. You could hold it up and say, oh, look, there's a white powdery substance in this envelope. I think it best that I not open this envelope. And so what a stupid idea. You can imagine, somebody who wants to murder people with anthrax going to the stationery store and saying, okay, let's see, which kind of envelope should I purchase for my crime that I'm going to do? Should I buy this envelope that has the transparent window at the bottom, which would allow people to see the white powdery substance before they open it? Or should I buy this traditional envelope that has no such window? Decisions. I mean, it's if you engineer something like that into the product, the criminals are not going to use it. They'll use something else. And so, we could come up with another cryptocurrency that has certain properties that make it easier to detect money laundering and sanction evading, or to try to mitigate it in some way. But the criminals are not going to use that particular cryptocurrency.
Yeah, I had Scott Stornetta on the podcast a few weeks back, and obviously he was a cryptographer who put together the idea of blockchain, right? This idea of chaining digital signatures together that inspired Satoshi, and he still felt like, to him, despite kind of what he's seen with countries talking about buying Bitcoin and nation states buying it, and after 16 years, there being nobody able to kind of counterfeit the supply, he's still kind of in search for a better solution, right? In his mind, there's still a way to kind of have, as he described it, like a perfect money where everyone maybe did have privacy. Do you think that you're still? It sounds like you still might be interested in a sort of more perfect Bitcoin.
Yeah, I would like to try to find ways to improve it. I mean, one of the things that fiat currencies have in normal banking is that if somebody commits fraud, it's possible to sue them in the court of law. Through litigation, you might be able to get your money back, or maybe even just call your bank and say, "Hey, this morning someone took a bunch of money out of my account without my permission," and maybe the bank can claw it back. With Bitcoin, they can't. It's just it's already gone. So I kind of like the idea of human beings being able to get involved to try to undo something that was wrong. But that's kind of baked into Bitcoin, that you can't do that. And so, a lot of people think of that irreversibility of Bitcoin as being a feature. Well, some people might think of it as a bug. It would be interesting to see if it's possible to engineer some extra features in that would help us mitigate some of these problems. It might be more broadly popular if you could do that. Again, the criminals probably won't choose to use something that has these hypothetical features that I'm talking about. I don't have a design for these features. I'm just doing a little thinking out loud here.
Do you use Bitcoin or cryptocurrencies, or have you kind of in the recent state, and like as an end user, what kind of things do you use it for?
Well, one of the some years ago, somebody gave me some Bitcoin, and I had it for a while, and then I lost, I lost my Bitcoin wallet. And it wasn't a lot, but it was enough to, it was a few $1,000s. But it was enough to, teach me a lesson. Don't lose your Bitcoin wallet. So, there's that story of the guy who had, hundreds of millions of dollars in Bitcoin on a disk drive that it fell into a landfill somehow. And he's been desperately trying to get it back, but it hasn't gone well for him. Well, these are heartbreaking stories, right? That's you could lose that much money. If the guy had lost his bank account, checkbook, or his credit card in the landfill, he wouldn't be negotiating with the landfill operator to say, "Can I please come in with some heavy earth moving equipment and spend a couple of weeks, digging through your landfill?" No, he would call his bank. He would say, "Hey, I lost my bank card. Could you issue another one?" Or, whatever. See, there's some advantage in having banks. You have some recourse when something goes wrong. Well, I didn't have that recourse when I lost my Bitcoin wallet.
You can now earn real yield on your Bitcoin by simply holding it. The core blockchain, Bitcoin's leading scaling solution, rewards you for keeping your Bitcoin right where it is. Here's how it works. Core is secured by a group of validators. When you lock up your BTC using Bitcoin's native time lock, you help elect validators to secure the core network. In return, your validator earns rewards and passes them back to you. While time locked, your Bitcoin never leaves your wallets. No bridging, no lending, no counterparties. When the time lock expires, you get it back, completely untouched. Still your keys, still your coins, now your yield. Want to earn even more? Lock up core tokens along with your BTC to unlock higher yields through dual staking. Learn more and get started at stake.coredao.org/blockworks. For the past decade, Ledger has been the global leader in digital asset security, trusted to secure more than 20% of the world's crypto assets. Celebrating 10 years of innovation, Ledger is making digital ownership more secure and accessible with their latest products, Ledger Stacks and Ledger Flex. These wallets feature the world's first secure touchscreens, simplifying your digital transactions while ensuring uncompromising security through Ledger's secure chip and proprietary OS. Plus, with the Ledger Security Key app, you can say goodbye to traditional passwords and step up your digital protection. Ready to protect your assets? Choose the most trusted name in hardware wallets, Ledger, and take control of your digital security today at ledger.com.
Well, I think people maybe who are advocates for Bitcoin would, kind of point to this idea that, among kind of global monies, a lot of these kind of fiat currencies are very highly inflationary. A lot of these banks kind of are rehypothecating funds. The security you kind of get with being able to cryptographically hold some value that can't be debased, within the kind of the global money structure is pretty high, right? That's maybe why we see the Bitcoin price, today around $100,000. I'm curious as you see that, because you've been at these conferences now and you've seen kind of this big vision, right? And if I were to kind of maybe lampoon my own industry, right? The Bitcoin industry kind of likes to see itself as part of this movement of really something that's going to become the global monetary system, right? Or even to replace kind of the global money structure. It sounds like you don't maybe see these as. It sounds like you might see these as realistic.
I don't think it's realistic to think of a sort of a Bitcoin maximalist worldview that all of our currencies are going to be Bitcoin. Theoretically, in some science fiction world, it could happen, but in the real world, I don't know. It's seems unlikely. There's so many advantages to fiat currencies. Like I said, if I lose my my checkbook or my bank card or something, I can call the bank and have them replaced. If there's a fraudulent transaction, I can litigate it and get it reversed. Maybe not. It could be somebody reaches across the internet from the other side of the world and empties my bank account. Then maybe it might be hard. But in a lot of typical cases of fraud, if you have the help of a bank and law enforcement and litigation, you might be able to get your money back. What I'm trying to say is that I don't believe in the Bitcoin maximalist vision, but that doesn't mean that I think that there's no place for Bitcoin. I think there is a place for Bitcoin, and I specifically saw that that's especially useful when I was speaking in Argentina and met a lot of people from Latin American countries that either were currently experiencing autocracies or had recently gone through an autocratic period. They were interested in Bitcoin because of its resistance to being confiscated by an oppressive government. And I thought that was, that appeals to my human rights sensibilities. So I like that. I like that about Bitcoin. So as I said, it produces mixed effects.
Well, I think what the question I was hoping to turn to was this idea that we have that we are sort of maybe even have lived through a second crypto war, right? So in yourself, you developed technology, you released it to the public, PGP allowed people to send private emails, became widely popular. You found yourself in the crosshairs of the US government. A lot of people in Bitcoin and crypto identify with that story because we've seen a lot of the builders and coders of our generation go through that same thing. You mentioned Silk Road earlier. Ross Ulbricht, who was arrested, convicted, served 12 years in prison for creating an online drug website. There's the Samurai Wallet developers who are they have an open source kind of software based wallet program that allows you to get more privacy with your Bitcoin. They have ended up in court. I guess, how do you look at this new generation of crypto builders? Do you see them as being in the spirit of the things you were fighting for?
It's a mixed bag. I've spoken at a lot of cryptocurrency conferences, and especially in the non-Bitcoin world, it's absolutely rife with fraud. Everybody's got their own cryptocurrency, and it's pump and dump everywhere you look. I don't think of Bitcoin as a pump and dump currency. It has quite a bit of gravitas to it. It's a lot of inertia, so it's probably not going to be just. Although lots of things can be pumped and dumped. The stock market can, and Bitcoin does fluctuate rapidly. So there might be a certain amount of that, but overall, Bitcoin is more solid. It's kind of more like a reserve currency. Although look, Bitcoin isn't like a fiat currency. It's hard to think of it as a real currency because it changes so rapidly. The euro, the dollar, the British pound, the Japanese yen, these things change more smoothly. And so you can conduct purchases and transactions with it. You can take money out of the bank and pay somebody with it, and when it reaches their bank account, it'll be about the same value as when it left your bank account. And so there's very non-currency behavior in cryptocurrencies, including Bitcoin. In Bitcoin, I think there's stronger incentive to hold it. In fiat currencies, we don't have such a strong incentive to hold them. We go to work, we get our salary, we pay our bills, we maybe try to save a little, and we live our normal, stable lives with stable fiat currencies. But with Bitcoin, when you get your hands on some Bitcoin, you have a stronger incentive not to spend it. And that creates deflationary pressures, and it makes it more difficult to use it as a currency in the normal sense. You don't go to Starbucks and buy a cappuccino with Bitcoin. For one thing, it costs a lot more for the processing and energy use than it costs for the cappuccino. The proof of work idea was a brilliant breakthrough to prevent double spending. But if it weren't for AI right now, the pie chart of worldwide energy usage would have a growing wedge of that pie for Bitcoin. But now it's being edged out by AI, machine learning, large language models.
What I think the question was more about like kind of the specific projects that have actually built on Bitcoin and that the community has championed, right? Because some people might look at a project like a privacy wallet for Bitcoin, and they might kind of see a similarity to what you did with PGP, right? People are just trying to send emails. You created a software that made that more private. With something like the Samurai Wallet, people are trying to send Bitcoin. They created a open source software where you can send Bitcoin to that address. You get some Bitcoin back, and you're able to kind of obscure to the blockchain how you received that money. In the same way, maybe there was remailers that have obscured the source of emails. That's something that I know Hal Finney wrote a lot about, and thought also was kind of core to the internet. So with these kind of schemes, right, that people have created. I'm kind of curious about, the government reaction to them has been similarly very harsh, right? They've been jailed, arrested, and I'm wondering, kind of your view on that.
The question about getting jailed probably helped motivate Satoshi's decisions to remain anonymous. Because in Satoshi's case, I would think that he might have observed the problems that I went through, but he also probably thought about criminals putting pressure on him. It's not only the law enforcement, but it's also criminals. There's a lot of opportunities for blackmail and extortion with Bitcoin, uh, especially from far away. You're being pressured to send Bitcoin to the other side of the world or else.
Well, I know with your kind of years-long fight for PGP, it took a period of years for the U.S. government to eventually back off, right, and allow cryptography to be used.
And that's because there was a consensus in society that it was time to allow people to have strong cryptography, and that was true on both sides of the Atlantic. Um, I'm not sure if we've seen the same consensus for Bitcoin. There's still some stigma associated with the criminal activities. It's not the fault of Bitcoin as a technology, but it does. There is an awful lot of the fraud and money laundering and things like that. I don't think Bitcoin is that great for money laundering because it's a permanent ledger. But in the case of strong cryptography in general, and PGP was kind of the real world example of it in the 90s. There was a broad consensus across the whole of society, and it took years of public discourse and debate to reach that consensus, and that's what led to the relaxation of the export controls in the U.S. and the domestic controls in France. And Britain had a little bit of both. They relaxed those. And everybody transitioned to using strong cryptography in a pervasive way that became part of every browser and mail clients and PGP and VPNs and just everywhere, ubiquitous strong cryptography. So there was an almost universal consensus that led to that change. And I haven't seen that consensus yet in Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies.
Yeah, I was going to say the other noticeable difference between those time periods is, while you sort of opposed the Clinton administration and their ITAR kind of regulations that were in place at the time. This generation of cryptographers who are working on Bitcoin, they really kind of appealed to the political system, and in some ways, kind of the end. Of their persecution was a bit of a partisan, victory, right? Essentially, there was a large-scale effort within the industry to support President Trump's candidacy. Trump obviously, involved in the NFTs and crypto applications, and ultimately became a champion for the industry, and that has resulted in pardons, people being released. So it sounds like, I guess you see a difference between, should this generation have kind of fought it out and kind of fought it through the courts rather than kind of going through this, political dynamic to ultimately maybe get to the same goal, which is that people have more privacy, more rights.
I would have preferred to see, an effort to get it through the courts, because then, in a courtroom, you have a careful presentation of ideas and arguments and through multiple types of litigation, you could get a lot of judicial review that could weigh it carefully on its merits. Whereas a politician might have complicated reasons for relaxing the controls on cryptocurrencies, and maybe those reasons might be more self-serving.
Interesting. And so, to this generation, I guess, who's kind of still going forward, I guess what is the final kind of way that you would look at this? Is it right for us to think that this was a second crypto wars, or do you think that these are these similar kind of historical events? What you did with PGP and championing that through the courts, and what these kind of innovators and Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies did in order to, again, maybe pursue the same values. But it sounds like you don't think maybe that they achieved that.
Well, as I said at the beginning of our conversation, A lot of these technologies have mixed effects on society. And so I see some good effects that come from Bitcoin, but I also see bad effects. And what is the ratio of the good effects and the bad effects? It was inevitable that the export controls on strong cryptography would collapse. During the 3 years of my criminal investigation, I did about 5 press interviews a week, and every single one of them were in my favor. Not 99%, not 99.9%. Every last one of them were in my favor. So there was a very strong consensus that the laws had to change. And we see some back and forth on these questions for cryptocurrencies, but it isn't 100%. It's a mixed bag. And so I think that I like to see these things pondered by the body politic. I like to see them debated and weighed carefully and to try to arrive at a conclusion. It took us a whole decade to arrive at a conclusion about what to do about strong cryptography. And we had broad participation from academia, from human rights groups, from journalists, from universities, from law enforcement, from intel agencies. Everybody participated, and we reached a consensus. It was not quite a consensus. The FBI never gave up, but NSA they didn't care. They figured they'd get what they needed some other way, which involves planting malware in their targets' platforms.
I'm curious. Do you place obviously freedom of speech was a big kind of cornerstone issue for what you were doing, and then just for the entire kind of internet rights of the first era. I'd say today there's this idea that we should have freedom to transact, right? And that's kind of driven a lot of the political discourse around Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies, right? This idea that we should have options outside of the government system. People should be able to write and release these softwares to the extent that they're currently available. They should be able to, kind of build as they see fit, right? A lot of the people I think who have gone to jail have simply built new things with technology, right? So with Silk Road, it's somebody built a marketplace that was, enabled by Bitcoin. These are just kind of simply new applications of technology that were maybe, maybe the effects were mixed, as you say, but they faced, real harsh political consequences.
Well, I think it depends on what they were doing. It's not. It shouldn't be illegal to have software that conducts financial transactions. But if someone opens a business in drug dealing and selling other things that are illegal, then we shouldn't confuse the creation of software that does transactions with doing the transactions. If the transactions are things that are widely regarded by society as being harmful to society, it wasn't only drugs that Silk Road was selling. If that was a brick and mortar operation without any cryptocurrency, they still would have been arrested. It's not that, oh, let's do it with software. Okay, now it's okay. No, it's the nature of the transactions, what they were selling. That's where the crime was. And if it was brick and mortar, then they still would have been arrested. So I don't see anything. There shouldn't be laws against writing software to do retail sales, whether it's certainly not for using Bitcoin to buy things. It's the nature of the transactions that is the reason why somebody went to jail.
Well, there is this sort of rejection of the paternalism of the state, also, right? This idea that it's okay for the government to regulate some things, but with new technologies, cryptocurrencies, Bitcoin and beyond, we don't know much about them, and if we can't experiment,
I would like to see Bitcoin used for all kinds of normal transactions. As I understand it, there was an effort to do that in El Salvador, by making it a legal tender. On the other hand, there's a lot of poor people in El Salvador that barely make enough money to live. And if they get paid a salary in Bitcoin and 25 minutes after they get paid, it drops 10%, well, then and they try to buy food with that. Well, they got to tell their kids, sorry, we got 10% less to eat this month or whatever. It's harder for them. Bitcoin is okay for people with disposable income that invest it and keep their money in it for years and let it grow. But for subsistence, earning a living and living paycheck to paycheck, if it drops in value, in the blink of an eye, and you're barely able to make rent and have enough left to buy food for your children, that could be catastrophic for you. In a country like El Salvador, you're more likely to run into a lot of people that live that way. So, I don't see Bitcoin as a panacea. I see it as an interesting technology that can have a lot of interesting uses. I like the idea of being able to instantly move money around. It's great, but I use PayPal, and they take a bite of that. But on the other hand, the intense computation for Bitcoin also takes a bite out of it.
So as you think about the privacy for money issue, I mean, it seems like with PGP, you thought that people should really be entitled to strong privacy rights to their speech. How do you think about the privacy?
And here's another reason why I think why I see a difference is that for thousands of years, or maybe a million years, humans could talk to each other privately. Before there was all this technology, before the invention of the telephone or the telegraph, or if you talk to someone, nobody can hear you talk unless you happen to be standing near someone else who's listening, which maybe that's okay for that conversation. But if you want to have a private conversation, just take a few steps over that way and have your private conversation. Go out behind the barn and talk there. That's been true for a million years of human history. And so we evolved that way. Our brains developed that way, that we can have private conversations with people. And so when we lost that because of advances in technology that mediates all of our communications through electronic channels that could be intercepted, that's knocking us out of the balance of how our brains evolved for a million years. We needed to restore the privacy that we enjoyed for countless millennia, that was taken away from us, not by some evil government, but just the nature of the technology. The nature of the technology was making it harder and harder for people to have any kind of privacy. At the time that I published PGP, it was impossible for the average person to have a private conversation over great distances. You could have a private conversation face to face out behind the barn, but you couldn't do it over great distances. Every kind of communication you could think of was subject to interception. And so I was just trying to restore what we once had.
Well, I think maybe an interesting way to look at that within the lens of people who, are for this freedom to transact is maybe they would make the argument and say, for millennia, we chose what to value. We dug gold out of the ground. We
Yeah.
gold coins.
I agree. We conducted financial transactions, with whatever, we could either barter or the invention of money. I mean, money is such a fascinating concept. And a lot of the ways in which we could make deals was pretty much anonymous. If you got your hands on some cash, you could go buy something with it. I ought to be able to go into a bookstore and buy a book without anyone knowing what book I bought, without the bank knowing which book I bought.
Would you say though, with credit cards and kind of these kind of larger systems, though, that also has gone away in a similar
Oh, I know, and we need to try to figure out a way to get that back. And you can do electronic transactions with Bitcoin that makes the money hard to trace. But, I could always walk into a bookstore with cash and buy a book and nobody knows I bought the book. But if I use my credit card, then it's tied to their inventory control system, and you could go into the database and see who bought this book, that we have to order a replacement book because we sold 10 of these books last week. We got to buy 10 more to keep our inventory balanced. And look, here's the people that bought this book. It's in our database. I'd like to get that back. That's privacy that we lost. And Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies could conceivably bring that back to us.
It seems like that, in the case, and I'll bring up the Scott Sternetta conversation again, because, something that I asked him, and I'm curious for your response too, is I think there's this idea that among some of the kind of computer science, people, who have worked on it for as long as yourself, that there's potentially a better, way to kind of have kind of a non-government money system. But there's also sort of a discomfort with the volatility, around the currency price. And so the question that I asked, and maybe I'd repeat to you again, is how else would you bootstrap sort of a non-government currency, if not through sort of this decentralized process, right? So if maybe it's taken many years for the kind of user base of Bitcoin to grow, but there is no government to kind of impose a Bitcoin.
Yeah, I would like to see less volatility, and also I'd like to not boil the oceans to have it.
And that's with you're talking about the externality of like energy use from mining.
Yeah, I learned a lot of things by speaking at all these Bitcoin conferences. One of the most interesting thing is that it is possible to get energy from stranded energy in order to do Bitcoin mining. There are places where you really can't export that energy. I mean, there's rivers in Africa that you can put tiny little turbines that generate electricity that you can't send that electricity to a city hundreds of miles away. You can run a nearby village with it, but it might produce more energy than the village needs, and maybe you could use that to do Bitcoin mining. Or there's, maybe when they drill oil wells, they might have to burn off the natural gas that comes along with the oil, and that's going to do carbon emissions that will add to climate change. Or worse, if you don't burn it, if you just vent it, because methane is many times more powerful as a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. So what are you going to do? You've got a pipeline from that well for carrying oil, but you don't have a pipeline for carrying the gas, because the gas is a byproduct of it. What can you do? Well, you can bring a tractor trailer full of Bitcoin mining gear, and bring it on site and burn the natural gas to run a generator to power the Bitcoin mining there. So that's what they call stranded energy. And I think stranded energy is an interesting idea for Bitcoin mining. But the problem that I see is that most Bitcoin mining is not using stranded energy. It's using energy. You could have it use green energy, but you're doing that often in environments where everyone else wants to buy the same green energy. You might have millions of people, who want to buy the green energy. Maybe there's solar farms or there's windmills or who knows, but they want to use that to run their homes or their offices. And they have to compete. And if you divert that over to Bitcoin mining, well, then these people might have to buy electricity made from coal, because that's all they can get, because all the green energy was diverted to Bitcoin mining. It's fungible, And so I think in the case of stranded energy, that's a good story for Bitcoin. I like that. But energy is fungible. And so if you use stranded energy, if you use stranded energy, then it's not fungible, because you can't get it away from that place where the stranded energy lives. And so I think the stranded energy is, what I'd like to see is, I'd like to figure out a way to put some kind of tags on Bitcoins that are mined purely with stranded energy. And then, assuming that they don't lie about the tags, there would have to be a certain amount of reputation. Then we might be onto something if we could do that.
Maybe as kind of a, kind of going back to the original kind of way we started the conversation, I'm just curious, PGP, as you mentioned, pretty widely accepted and standardized, right? Most governments and businesses, widely use it, and it's encouraged. I worked for a crypto exchange for a while. PGP emails are the norm there. How does Bitcoin reach that level of ubiquity in your view? And what things? I mean, you mentioned a few of them already, but I guess what kind of things would you look for if in 10, 20 years, Bitcoin has stabilized, many governments kind of own it, it becomes kind of the worldwide money. Does that make Bitcoin as successful as PGP?
Well, I like to say that PGP fell short on network effect also. The number of people using PGP is nowhere near the number of people that use WhatsApp. To get Bitcoin into a network effect cycle, you'd have to figure out a way to get. I think you'd have to regulate it more. You'd have to try to wash off the stigma of criminal fraud, that pervades the whole ecosystem of cryptocurrencies, which Bitcoin might not be as guilty of as so many other cryptocurrencies, but it's still there. You need to rehabilitate the public image of it.
And maybe I guess for people who are watching, who are builders, people who are entrepreneurs in the space, why should the Bitcoin community pay more attention to the secure communications field that you're working on still?
Well, you can't live without secure end-to-end encryption. I mean, one thing that comes to mind about secure end-to-end encryption is that at this point in history, we're seeing a massive growth of autocracies around the world. We're seeing democracies elect autocrats, through a normal election. But then those autocrats use their executive power to seize control of lots and lots of things in society that makes a whole democracy. A liberal democracy is not simply elections. It's, independent judiciary. It's freedom of the press. It's, other things in civil society. It's freedom of speech in general, not just for the journalists who publish things, but also the everyday people talking to each other. Viktor Orban was elected in a free and fair election, but he used his executive power to take control of the different parts of society and has turned Hungary into an autocracy where he can't possibly lose an election. We see this all over the world. And if an autocrat comes to power, then we need to be able to organize against them so that if we're lucky, we can get through the next election cycle in such a way that we could get our democracy back. But if we let it go too long through several election cycles, then we'll never be able to get it back. Hungary finds it very difficult through normal elections. They don't have normal elections in Hungary. But again, it's not just Hungary; it's lots of countries. And right now, the big concern that a lot of us feel is the United States. And at the time we're recording this, yesterday or a couple of days ago, Romania had an election that elected a pro-Putin candidate, and now they have to have a runoff election. By the time this podcast airs, maybe they'll have done the runoff. But it is worrisome that somebody who sides with Putin will become head of state of a NATO country that's important right up, in borders on Ukraine. So we need to have the means of organizing against an autocrat. And the only way you can do that, you have to do a lot of things to resist that. But part of it is you need end-to-end encryption. Because if you want to organize politically, you have to feel safe. You don't want to get arrested for speaking against the autocrat. You need to have privacy in order to have democracy. I guess another thing I'd like to say is that, some people have suggested that I try to engage our members of Congress or something like that to talk about, encryption policy. But I can't. And the reason why I can't is because there's bigger issues going on right now. And members of Congress are struggling with issues about democracy, and it isn't only in the U.S. It's in European countries too. Alternative for Deutschland, is a growing influence in Germany, and the aforementioned Romanian election, and everybody's busy with trying to preserve democracy. My original motivation for developing PGP was all about human rights and democracy. It's hard for me to focus my attention on just encryption since my motivation for encryption was about the preservation of democracy. And that's what is in jeopardy right now. In many countries, many democratic, otherwise democratic countries are teetering on the edge. So this is the state of the world that we're in. We're seeing the metastasizing of autocracies.
Yeah, and then certainly I think a development would be that the political right has been much more friendly to Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies rather than the political left. I guess, do you think that there's some sort of inherent reason for that in your view?
I think the political left has made it easier for the political right to win elections, and that's something that worries me. I don't want to see the far right win elections. I mean, that tends to correlate with autocracies. There's been plenty of autocracies that are on the left. I mean, Venezuela is, ostensibly on the left. Russia is ostensibly, well, I don't know if Russia's on the left, but the Soviets were. I don't really think of it as left and right. I think of it as autocrats or, not autocrats. But I think that the far right gets a lot of their political success from governments moving too far to the left, and so I become more of a centrist.
Well, certainly we've seen the tech industry make a pretty big pivot there recently, and I know Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies were a big part of that. Some people kind of see it maybe as even the starting point with kind of Trump reaching out to the industry and building that coalition. And I think it's interesting because if you think about technologies have traditionally been viewed, I think in America at least, as more of a left issue, and now we find technology maybe swinging a bit more to the right.
Well, as I understand it, you have this podcast devoted, sharply focused on Bitcoin. And so, if you view everything through the lens of Bitcoin, then, well, okay, there's a lot of things happening in the world right now. I mean, do we need to think of everything through the lens of Bitcoin? I've been to Ukraine many times, and they're getting bombed. And when I think of Ukraine, I don't think of Bitcoin. I think of them getting bombed, and we ought to try to figure out a way to stop that by, getting Russia out of Ukraine. And that's not really very relevant to Bitcoin. So I'm concerned about a range of issues relating to human rights and democracy. My motivation for developing PGP was about human rights and democracy. It's a means to an end. It wasn't just an end in itself. And so, Bitcoin is technically interesting and also socially interesting. But I look at the broader picture of what we're going through right now. And what we're going through is the dangers of autocracies emerging from democracies. Democracies have always had this weakness of they might elect an autocrat, and then the autocrat will make it difficult to elect anyone else later.
Well, I mean, I don't mean to kind of be overly focused on Bitcoin or cryptocurrencies, but I would say from the data, right? Like this is the first election where the Bitcoin and crypto industry mobilized politically. There was hundreds of millions of dollars spent on lobbying. If you look at the data, the Bitcoin and crypto industry was the top spender, on the political lobbying side, and then kind of even in terms of the actual vote turnout, there's some data evidence to suggest that younger people who are more pro Bitcoin, more crypto, it's this is where we're getting jobs, right? This is where we're finding work, in the same way that maybe kind of young people of your generation were finding that in the internet. And at the end of the day, Bitcoin is a pocketbook issue, right? I mean, for myself, I have 95% of my wealth in Bitcoin. A lot of people that I work with in the industry have that as well, right? So that's I maybe don't see them as actually such a dissimilar issue, maybe as you, because I actually view it as, for the first time, maybe over the last year, we've actually seen them become relevant. And I guess my question would be, would you blame people for that? Because at the end of the day, people make financial decisions, right? People want to.
It's funny. Back in the 90s, especially in the early 90s, I debated a guy who was the general counsel at NSA. That was the big public policy debate of the 90s, the crypto wars. And I used to debate him. And years later, he was no longer with the NSA. He was a lawyer in private practice. He worked for a big law firm, and they were representing someone who was, against the controls on encryption. He was representing clients that were against the NSA, his former employer. And I ran into him in an elevator, and I said, his name was Stuart Baker, and I said, Stuart, I'm a little surprised to see you working on this now, considering your previous employment. And he said, well, where you stand depends on where you sit.
That's a nice wrap for the conversation. Phil, where can people find more about what you're currently working on?
For many years, I've been working on secure voice, voice over IP. There's a company that I founded years ago called Silent Circle. We have a product called Silent Phone. It doesn't have enough network effect because the company made some business decisions early on to not give it away for free. And so that means that, the number of people using it is much less than using Signal or WhatsApp. But go have a look at the website, and it's a great product. I also use Signal. Both of them are good products. These days, I just do consulting work and speaking at events, including a lot of, Bitcoin events.
Well, I was going to say, I hope to see you, at an event down the road, and I'm sure we'll sync up as we have in the past. But Phil, thanks for being on the podcast, and we will see you down the road.
It's my pleasure.